Mordecai again. Mordecai, remember in the end where we were last time, in Esther chapter 9, Mordecai had written a law. Let's start in chapter 9, verse 8. I just want to get the flow of where we are. We're in Esther chapter 9, verse 8. It says, "Now you write to the Jews as you see fit." So the king, Ahasuerus, has told Mordecai to write a new law that will supersede the law that Haman wrote. So he says, "Now you write to the Jews as you see fit in the king's name and seal it with the king's signet ring. For a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring may not be revoked." So the king's scribes were called at that time. That's what this photo kind of represents, this picture. The king's scribes were called at that time in the third month. That is the month Sivan. It's our June or July. And on the 23rd day it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, to the satraps, the governors, the princes of the provinces which extended from India to Ethiopia, just showing how vast the Persian Empire was. 127 provinces, to every province according to its script, so in its own language, in its own alphabet, to every people according to their language, as well as to the Jews. So it was written in Hebrew also, according to their script and their language. So this happened on the 23rd day of the third month. And as I said last time, this was 70 days, exactly 70 days after Haman, Satan's guy, after Haman, Satan's man on the scene here, had written the law. And Haman's law was that on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month Adar, all the Jews were to be killed. All the Jews in the Persian Empire were to be killed by everybody in the Persian Empire. Anybody could pick up arms and kill their neighbor on this one day, the 13th day of the 12th month. Because of what we just read that a law that is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring, it cannot be revoked, it can't be changed. So even though the king has understood, hey, that's a bad law, he knows the only way they can do something about it is to write a different law, and this is what Mordecai decided to do. So in verse 10 it says, "He wrote in the name of the king Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring and sent letters by couriers on horses, riding on steeds sired by the royal stud." Very interesting phrase. Maybe one day we'll come back to that. In verse 11, this is what Mordecai wrote in the new law, the law that was to override Haman's law. It says, "In them the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city." So all of the 127 provinces, all throughout the Persian Empire, this law that Mordecai wrote would give the Jews authority. And this is what it gave them the authority to do. It gave every Jew the right to assemble, the right to defend their lives. Isn't it interesting, in America we're writing laws or trying to write laws that are the reverse of what the God gave the rights to Israel. The right to assemble, the right to defend their lives, the right to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil. On one day, only one day, look at what it says, on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, that means in the entire Persian Empire, on this one day, the Jews could defend themselves to the death. The Jews could pick up arms. They could assemble in groups to defend themselves. It wasn't each man for his own household. They could assemble as an army of Israel. They could do whatever they needed to do to defend their wives, to defend their children, to defend their own lives on this one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month Adar. So a couple of facts here before we keep going. A Persian law cannot be revoked. We've talked about that. Can't be changed. Haman issued a law. Haman, who is now dead. But Haman earlier, 70 days earlier, had issued a law that on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month Adar, all Jews were to be killed. The only way to handle this law, the only way to get around it, it couldn't be changed. It's a very interesting law system that they wrote a law that couldn't be changed, but that's the way it was in Persia. So the only way to handle this law, and I wonder if God was okay with this law, the only way to handle the law was to pass a second law allowing the Jews to arm themselves for war. What's my favorite verse in the book of Genesis? Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. I'll show it to you in just a minute because I can't get away from it. I'll bless those who bless you, and I'll curse those who curse you. And here we have Haman and some of the Persians who want to destroy, kill, and annihilate the Jews. And we have God step up in the person of Mordecai and said, not on my watch, not going to happen. The Jews are going to pick up arms. They're going to arm themselves. They're going to be able to assemble and gather arms for this war. Gather arms, not turn their arms in. Gather arms for warfare against those that hate them. Mordecai the Jew writes a new law because Haman had written that law that on the 13th day of the 12th month all the Jews are going to die. So Mordecai the Jew writes a new law that on the 13th day of the 12th month, the very same day, when people come to attack the Jews could fight back. The Jews had the right to assemble to defend their lives, killing all attackers of Israel. And he also added, and to take their possessions. It says, to plunder their spoil. Remember, this is the exact opposite of what Haman wanted to do. Haman wanted to kill all the Jews and take all the Jews' possessions. Well, God flipped it 180 degrees on Satan and Haman and allows the Jews to do exactly what the Persians wanted to do to them. Look what it says in Esther chapter 9. Now, just so you know, 8 months have gone by. About 8 months go by between chapter 8, verse 9, and Esther chapter 9, verse 1. Haman wrote that law. 70 days later, Mordecai wrote a law. And now 8 months have passed. Israel has been assembling, figuring out how to fight war against the Persians who might come to kill them. 8 months have gone by, and this is what it says. Now we drop into the day we've been talking about for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. Now we drop into the day. Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day. So it's the dawn of the 13th day of the 12th month. It's killing time. It's the day that Haman wrote into law all the Jews would be killed. It's the very same day that Mordecai wrote into law all the Jews can defend themselves. Let's see what happens. The 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them by annihilating them, wiping them out of the Persian Empire, wiping them off the earth, basically, it says it was turned to the contrary. The opposite occurred, so that the Jews themselves gained the mastery over those who hated them. Here's the verse again. I'll bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And here we've got the Persians under Haman who've written this law to kill all the Jews, and God says, you deserve cursing for trying to curse my people. And people say that God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. I don't think he needs to be, to see that God is moving in the book of Esther, protecting his people Israel. So keep reading, see what it says here. The Jews assembled in their cities. By the way, the date is it's March. The 12th month to the Jew is our month March. It's 473 BC. We know that. That's a good hard date. 473 BC is when Esther chapter 9 takes place. It says the Jews assembled in their cities because they were given the right to do that. The Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands, that means to kill, to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could stand before them. No one could defeat the Jews. For the dread of them had fallen on all the peoples. Now, this is perfect justice. Haman wanted to kill the Jews, And Mordecai's law gave the Jews the right to defend themselves and to kill only those who wanted to kill them. The Jews aren't given some killing spree where they can just go out and kill anybody that they see on the street. Only the people that brought their lives, the Jewish lives, into danger, those people could be killed by Israel. So God is perfectly just in what He's doing here. Haman and Satan wanted to take from Israel their lives, and after they took their lives, they wanted to take all their possessions. So what has God allowed? The contrary of that, the opposite of that. And now Israel will take the lives of all the people that want to kill them, and they've also been given the authority to take their possessions. As we'll see, Israel doesn't want their junk. It's interesting. If you went into a house and somebody said you can have anything you want, you'd think you'd take something. But the hatred against Israel was so ingrained in these people, and months had gone by. Remember, 8 months have gone by. And Israel, I wonder if there was conversation on the street. I wonder if there were conflicts that came before this date about how I'm going to kill you in a couple of months. I just wonder the hatred of the people, the Persians that wanted Israel dead. I wonder if there were conflict, if there was conversation, if there was argument. Because by the time we get to this date, Israel so hates these people that they don't want their stuff. They don't take their plunder. Even though Mordecai's law gave them the right to it, they don't want any of it. They just want to defend their lives. The Jews assembled, no one could stand before them. Verse 3 says, even all the princes of the provinces. And listen to this. This is an astounding bit of history. Even all the princes of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and those who were doing the king's business assisted the Jews. What a change in a story in Persia, where a few months earlier Haman has convinced the king that all the Jews need to die, and all of a sudden the king has had the scales taken off his eyes. He's given Mordecai authority to write a new law, and all of a sudden the princes and all these authority figures in Persia are helping the Jews because the dread of Mordecai had fallen on them. So not only do we see Israel killing the people that wanted them dead, we see that some of the Gentiles came alongside Israel and fought for Israel. An astounding verse in the Bible. Verse 4 says, indeed Mordecai, it speaks of Mordecai's greatness. It just says the dread of Mordecai had fallen on them because he's rising so quickly in the empire, in authority. It says, indeed Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For the man Mordecai became greater and greater. Now let me ask you this, the sad part of the story, because we have to be fair with the Bible and we have to be fair with the Jews. Where should this Mordecai have been if he wanted to please God? He's in Susa, the citadel of Persia. He's in the capital of Persia. Israel was kicked out of the land by God because of idolatry. God said, you'll stay outside of the land of promise for 70 years. He said that through the prophet Jeremiah. The 70 years have gone by. They have well gone by. All the Jews should have gone back into the land of Canaan, the promised land, the land where their fathers were given an inheritance. The Jews are to live in Israel always. So these people, Mordecai and Esther, as great as this story is and as much as God used them, they were unfaithful Jews. They should have been back in their tribal allotment land in the land of Canaan. But they chose not to go back to Israel for whatever reason. They chose to stay in the Persian Empire. God can use disobedient, unfaithful people. The book of Esther is proof of it. The reason I say all this is because look what it says about Mordecai. In whose eyes was Mordecai being honored? Are these God's words, saying God lifted up Mordecai like God brought Job back to health and gave Job more children than he had before and gave Job more possessions and donkeys and camels and all the rest more than he had before? Is this God lifting up Mordecai is the question? Or is this Mordecai just climbing a ladder on the human scene? God's not involved in this. It says, indeed, Mordecai was great in the king's house. But what about the King of Kings' house? What about God's house? What about Israel? No, Mordecai was unfaithful, not doing what he should have been doing. But God still used him in a mighty way. Even when we are unfaithful, he is faithful, for he cannot deny himself. God had a plan. And the plan included Israel. Remember what we talked about this morning in the first hour. God made promises to Abraham that through Abraham's people, Israel, all the nations of the world would be blessed. If God allowed the Persians to kill all the Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month, all of a sudden God breaks a promise. God breaks a promise because part of the Persian Empire, where all the Jews were to be slaughtered on this day, part of the empire was the land of Israel, where the seed was, in a man named Zerubbabel. If all the Jews would have died that day, if Haman would have had his way, then the seed of the woman, the seed, Abraham's seed that we saw this morning, that eventually and ultimately was Jesus Christ, would have been lost in the Persian Empire. God had to step in. So even though you don't see God's name, Yahweh, in the book of Esther, even though you don't see prayer, even though you don't see anything about the Mosaic law being followed by these Jews, they are unfaithful, non-worshiping Jews at the moment, but that doesn't change God's promise to save you, Christian, and to save me through the Jew named Jesus. These people have to stay on the planet always. Israel will never be wiped off the face of this earth, and God will see to it, because He's made them not only promises He's already kept, but He's made them eternal promises. So no one will wipe Israel off the face of this earth, and we see it in the book of Esther. Keep reading. Mordecai, he was great in men's eyes. He wasn't growing in stature in God's eyes. Thus the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword. On this one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the Jews killed all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. Look what it says on the board. The one who curses you, I will curse. God's given the authority to Israel to defend themselves. They still have that authority today. It says at the citadel in Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Let's start a tally here. So in Susa, where the king lived, where Queen Esther lived, where Mordecai sat in the gate of the king as some sort of authority, on that day, the 13th day of the month, 500 Persian men were killed by the Jews. And then it has a list of 10 people's names. These are the 10 sons of Haman. Haman, who started all this mess. His sons are listed in the Bible. All their names are here. I'll try it. Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Porata. Not Jewish names, you can tell. Persian names. They don't have a Jewish ring. They're not Jewish names. Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta. Parmashta almost sounds Indian. Arisai, Aridai, and Vizata. It's my best. These are the 10 sons of Haman. And what happened to them? The Jews' enemy, Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Jews' enemy, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. So in Susa, 500 men were killed, and Haman's 10 sons were killed. They're dead. Now listen to what else it says here. On that day, the number of those who were killed at the citadel in Susa was reported to the king. 500 men have been killed, king. And the king brings Esther in and says, what else do you want? What else can I do for you? I've saved your life. I've saved the lives of your people. What else can I do for you, my queen? The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman at the citadel in Susa. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? If they killed 500 here, they must have killed thousands in all of the 127 provinces. Now he says, now what is your petition? What else can I do for you, wife? It shall even be granted to you. And what is your further request? It shall be done. And this is what Esther says. If it pleases the king, let tomorrow also be granted to the Jews who are in Susa to do according to the edict of today. And let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. Now let's take the first part first. What is Esther asking for? Another day when the Jews can defend their lives in the citadel, in the city of Susa, because there's more people that weren't killed. The day wasn't long enough. So Esther needs another day. Esther asked for another day. I'm sure she had intel from Mordecai and from other Jews saying, we didn't have enough time to kill all our enemies in the city. We need more time to finish this. So Esther goes and asks for another day. But the other interesting part of this verse is it says, let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. Are they alive? Are Haman's 10 sons alive? Or in verse 10, does it say they were killed by the Jews? Why would Esther want to hang dead bodies up, impale them on these spikes? Why would you do it? To set an example. To let everybody else who in the Persian Empire may want to rise up against Israel, will do to you what we did to those 10 right there. It was a deterrent for the hatred of Israel. Esther, we don't know whether it was just her or Mordecai whispering in her ear, but Esther wanted Haman's 10 sons hung up, impaled, their dead bodies, so that everybody could see them. Interesting. So the king commanded that it should be done. And an edict was issued in Susa, and Haman's 10 sons were hanged, or we've seen better in the Hebrew, impaled. Not hung from the neck with the rope. That's not how they killed people then. In verse 15, the Jews who were in Susa assembled also on the 14th day. Esther wants another day. The king says, yes, you may have another day. So the Jews in Susa assembled also on the 14th day of the month Adar and killed 300 men in Susa. The first day they had barely killed over half of them. The second day they killed another 300 men. Are you keeping track? 500 men, 300 men. This is just in one city. In one city. They did not lay their hands on the plunder. Interesting statement. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. They didn't want their stuff. They didn't want their stuff. What about the rest of the empire? We know what happens in the capital city, but look what else. In verse 16, now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces, the other 127 provinces in the Persian Empire, the rest of the Jews assembled to defend their lives, to rid themselves of their enemies, and killed 75,000 of those who hated them. 800 in the city of Susa, 75,000 who hated Israel. But look what it says about the Jews, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. They had the right to the stuff. They chose not to take it. They didn't want it. They didn't want it by then. So we have 500 men in Susa on the 13th. We have 300 more men in Susa the next day on the 14th. We've got 75,000 men in the provinces of Persia. So altogether, 75,800 men, now listen to this, hated Israel enough to think for 10 months that they could have backed off and said, hey, I don't want to go up against a Jew who can defend himself. I'll go kill a Jew. But if he's got something that can kill me, I'm going to lay down my arms. I don't want that. 75,800 people in the Persian Empire hated Israel enough and hated their God enough to risk their lives to go to battle with Israel. 75,800 men said it's worth it to risk our lives to go against Yahweh and His people Israel. We want them dead. They had months to think about this. Amazing that their hatred for Israel was so great. In verse 17, this was done on the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day they rested. So we're talking about in the outskirts, everywhere but the capital city. The 75,000 men were killed on the 13th day, and on the 14th day they rested. They didn't have anybody else they needed to kill. Nobody else was coming after them. And they made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. That's the Feast of Purim. Purim, P-U-R-I-M. They still celebrate that. If we have a minute, I'll show you somewhere where I think Jesus celebrated the Feast of Purim. I blew it because I was going to ask you, what about Jesus? Took all my thunder. So in the countryside, they only needed one day. In the countryside, they only needed one day. They killed 75,000 people. In Susa, they needed 2 days to get it done in this one city. Verse 18 goes back to Susa. But the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and the 14th of the same month. And they rested on the 15th day and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. So we have 2 days here, the 13th and the 14th month days of the 12th month. Therefore the Jews of the rural areas in verse 19 who live in the rural towns make the 14th day of the month of Adar a holiday for rejoicing and feasting and sending portions of food to one another. Interesting, that's what they do on that holiday. They rejoice because Yahweh saved them from Haman and Satan, who wanted to annihilate them, wipe them off the planet. They also feast. They sit down to a meal. Our kind of people, right? And they send portions of food to one another. Interesting. The giving of gifts is food. Verse 20. We see more about this feast of Purim. Then Mordecai recorded these events. He wrote them in the history books and the chronicles of the kings of Persia. We'll see that book in just a minute. Mordecai recorded these events, what had taken place in Susa and what had taken place in the countryside, the numbers of people killed, etc. And he sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far. And Mordecai obliged them, obliging them to celebrate the 14th day of the month Adar and the 15th day of the same month annually. So Mordecai says we should have these as holidays, because on those days the Jews rid themselves of their enemies, and it was a month which was turned for them from sorrow to gladness. The great sorrow of having to know for months and months and months that I may be able to defend myself, but I might die trying. So their sorrow is now turned to gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and rejoicing and sending portions of food to one another. And they add one here, and gifts to the poor. Now, if we have time, remember that gifts to the poor when I ask you about Jesus and the Feast of Purim, gifts to the poor. Thus the Jews undertook what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. Verse 24, a little history lesson just to bring the picture back into focus. For Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the adversary of all the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast Pur, that is, the lot, to disturb them and destroy them. Remember at the beginning of this story, Haman wanted Mordecai and all his people killed, but he didn't know when. He had to figure out on what day, and what he did was cast lots. He cast lots to determine what month it would be, and then he cast lots to determine on what day of that month it should be, and that's how he came up with the 13th day of the 12th month. He cast lots, and that's why this word pur, which means the lot, we don't know what the lot was, exactly how they did it. I mean, I think of casting lots and my mind immediately goes to something like throwing dice. But I'm not saying that's what it is, but if you and I were to have some sort of contest, maybe today we would flip coins. There was a way that they would decide and narrow things down. What's the other thing we do? This thing? I mean, there was a way of casting lots then that made decisions for them. And that's what they did here. And the lot is called pur, P-U-R. When you add the I-M on it in a Hebrew word, that makes it plural. So Purim is the lots, the casting of lots. So because Haman had used the pur to determine what day the Jews should be killed on, the Jews called it almost in a sarcastic way the Feast of Purim, the Feast of Lots. Look what Haman wanted, look what Haman got. When it came to the king's attention, this idea of Haman wanting to destroy all the kings, he commanded by letter that his wicked scheme which he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. So we're seeing a turn in King Ahasuerus to be a lover of Israel here, it seems. Look what it says in verse 26. The holiday now, this feast of Purim, is formally established. Therefore they called these days Purim after the name of Pur, and because of the instructions in his letters, both what they had seen in this regard and what had happened to them, they lived through this, they saw it. The Jews established and made a custom for themselves and for their descendants. One of their descendants is named Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth. So they made a custom, a tradition, for themselves and for their descendants and for all those who allied themselves with them. So any Gentile who was favorable to the Jews, so that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days according to their regulation and according to their appointed time annually. Now let me ask you a question. Is this the Mosaic law? Is this the law that Yahweh gave Moses on Mount Sinai? Is this one of the feast days of Israel? Like the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Tabernacles. Is this one of those, or is this something new? Moses has been dead 1,000 years. This is something new. This is a tradition that Jews were to celebrate this. This is not part of the Mosaic law. I ask that question because would Jesus Christ, who is obviously a perfectly obedient Jew, a keeper of the Mosaic law, would Jesus Christ have to celebrate the Feast of Purim? What's the answer? No, he wasn't bound by the laws that God wrote and gave to Moses to celebrate this. But I think we see a place where he does. Let's keep reading, running out of time. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority. Now they've put it into law. They've cast the king's signet ring on it. They wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. He sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus the king, namely words of peace and truth, to establish these days of Purim at their appointed times. What are the times? The 13th and 14th days of the 12th month, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they had established for themselves and for their descendants with instructions for their times of fasting and their lamentations. Look at what it says in verse 32. The command of Esther, the queen, established these customs for Purim, and it was written in the book. What do the Jews do nowadays on Purim? They get together in the synagogues. They do this every year, 13th and 14th day of the 12th month, Adar. And they read the story of Esther from their Hebrew scrolls. And when they read the name Mordecai, everybody says, cursed be Mordecai. It's almost like a melodrama. you go to a melodrama, a play, and they throw popcorn at the actors. They engage with the story. So when the Jews do this, if you ever get invited to go to one of these readings, when when Haman's name is read, they say, "Cursed be Haman." And when Mordecai's name is read, what do they say? Read what's on the board. Blessed be Mordecai. Straight out of the book, straight out of Genesis. I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. They say, "Cursed be Haman," and when Mordecai's name comes up, they say, "Blessed be Mordecai." They exchange gifts of food with each other. They feast. And that's what they celebrate. It's a very, very happy day for Israel when they do this every year. It teaches the Jews that God is in control. Even when Israel was unfaithful, God can be counted on to be faithful to His promises to Israel. That's the feast of Purim. That's why it's such a good thing. It also encourages Israel to be faithful and to serve their God, Yahweh, because God preserved Israel through this story of Esther. Esther chapter 10, 3 verses. It talks about how God blessed the king, because what does it say in Genesis 12:3? "I will bless those who bless you." And King Ahasuerus, even though he allowed Haman to write that ridiculous law at first, he allowed Mordecai to clean the thing up and allowed the Jews in his territory, in his land that God had given him, in his empire, he allowed Israel to defend itself. And God blessed that. God blessed the king. Now King Ahasuerus laid a tribute on the land and on the coastlands of the sea. We're talking about the money that he gathered, that God allowed him to gather. All the accomplishments of his authority and his strength. You can go read about him in the normal history books. His name is Xerxes, Xerxes. He is King Xerxes. Great authority and great strength. And the full account of the greatness of Mordecai. Not only the king, but Mordecai was lifted into great authority, to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? Yes, they are. For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews. Again, to be fair, he wasn't a faithful Jew. He was not great in the eyes of God as a faithful servant of God. He just wasn't. But he was great among the Jews and in favor with his many kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people, and one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. Jesus. Turn to John chapter 5 quick. Now there is some debate, because there's always debate, as to whether this feast that's named in John chapter 5 is Esther's feast of Purim. Now I say that it is, and I'll tell you why. Because what you read about in John chapter 5 is a feast that falls on a Saturday, on a Sabbath day. There are only 7 feasts in Jerusalem. The Jerusalem calendar is 360 days long. We know that. We've known it forever. If you go back in time to the days of Jesus, the only feast day that fell on a Sabbath was in 28 AD, the Feast of Purim. The 13th and 14th days of the 12th month fell on a Sabbath. None of the other feast days did. So I think in John chapter 5, just the calendar that we can go back and look at indicates, to me at least, that this feast was the Feast of Purim. It says, after this there was a feast of the Jews. And I think this is Esther's 2-day feast, Purim. And Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Remember what I said, that one of the things they would do at the Feast of Purim was give gifts to the poor? See if Jesus gave a gift to anyone at this feast. Now there was in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, and paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water, for an angel went down. This is debatable. This is not in the original. Let's skip down to verse 5. The pool of Bethesda, sick, lame, blind people go to the pool of Bethesda. Verse 5, it says, now a certain man was there who had an infirmity for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he already had been in that condition a long time, that means 38 years, he said to him, do you want to be made well? The sick man answered him, he said, sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I'm coming, another steps down before me. We could talk about what that water stirring is, but I don't want to get sidetracked. In verse 8, Jesus said to him, rise, take up your bed, and walk. And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed, and walked. And that day was the Sabbath. So what do the Jews want to do? They want to kill him. It's a Sabbath day. And that day was a Sabbath. The Jews therefore said to him who was cured, is it the Sabbath? Is it not lawful for you? It is not lawful for you to carry your bed, etc. The reason I bring that up is because I think it's important for us to know about our Savior. Did our Savior ever celebrate the Feast of Purim? And I think in John chapter 5 he did. I think he recognized the feast and celebrated it here. And he also did what the Jews did at this feast day. He gave gifts to the poor. He made this lame man able to walk. So that's an aside. You can take that or leave it. I'll ask him when I get to the judgment seat, Lord, can I ask you one question? My first question of 100 million. In John chapter 5, was that Purim? And he'll say, no. Where in the world did you get that idea? Let's close in prayer.